Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 193, The Trade and Tribulations of the Free Imperial Cities, which is also episode 9 of season 10, The Empire in the 15th Century. Amongst the few perks the head of the General State Archives of Baden enjoyed were the occasional inspections of libraries across the country. It allows for journeys away from the office and occasionally came with the invitation to dinner at a splendid castle or monastery. And in 1911, few invitations could rival with the honor of going to Schloss Salem, the home of Prince Max von Baden, the heir to the Grand Duchy. It is likely that Dr. Karl Obser, he's the one who held that post as head of the archives in that year, enjoyed his time in the stunning Baroque Abbot's Palace not far from Lake Constance. But he was there not just for pleasure, but also for work. Though Salem had once been one of southern Germany's greatest Cistercian monasteries and had hence held a vast library and archives dating back to the 12th century, most of that material had long been shipped up to Karlsruhe. Therefore, expectations to find something exciting were more than modest. But Dr. Obser was clearly a thorough archivist and left no shelf untouched or bookcase unopened. In an attic room with a broken window he came across a drawer that must have been left open a long time ago, as it had become home to a family, most likely to generations of families, of sparrows. Still, Dr. Obser saw a few sheets of paper peeking up underneath the nest and investigated. What he discovered were 1,825 pages of paper holding the accounts of the great Ravensburg Trading Company, covering the years from 1450 to 1526. He had stumbled upon the most significant documentation of late medieval trading in the free imperial cities ever found. The great Ravensburg Trading Company was the largest single firm in Germany before the houses of Fugger and Welser reached their peak in the 16th century. Its accounts are a unique window in the way long-distant merchants operated in this period, what wares they traded, and what they thought was acceptable and what was unacceptable behavior. This, as well as the story of Heinrich Toppler, the dominant politician of Rothenburg ob der Taube, is what we're going to look into in this episode. But before we start, no, today I cannot be bothered. You already know how and why to help the show on historyofthegermans.com/support. So all I want to do is celebrate those amongst you who have already taken the plunge, namely Edgars Z, Georg V, Ben G, Paul M, Oblomov, Wade S, Tracy M, and from the other side of the galaxy, Lord Vader. And with that, back to the show. Ravensburg, and you are very much forgiven if you cannot place it on the map, is today a town of 50,000 in the far southeastern corner of Baden-Württemberg, between Friedrichshafen, the home of the Zeppelins, and the city of Ulm and its majestic church tower. If you have heard of it, it may be because of Ravensburger, the publisher of puzzles and board games, but you would not have associated it with a great mercantile or commercial activity. Nevertheless, in the 15th century, it housed the headquarters of a company that held a near monopoly in the trade between Spain and the Empire, and in certain wares, namely linen and a special cloth, variously called barchent, bombast, or fustian. Before we get into Ravensburg and the Grosse Handelsgesellschaft, we need to put the whole region in the context of the free imperial cities of the 15th century. Most people associate the idea of free imperial cities with Hamburg, Bremen, Lübeck, maybe Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg. These were indeed free cities, but they are geographical outliers. Few of the Hanse cities were free and imperial cities, in part because, they weren't in the empire, like Danzig, Riga, or Reval, or because they were never given immediacy, like Stralsund, Wismar, and Rostock. In actual fact, the highest concentration of free imperial cities was in a corridor from Nuremberg to Lindau, and then in parallel from Rottweil to Heilbronn. These include places that epitomize the idea of the German medieval town, like Rothenburg ob der Taube, Dinkelsbühl, Nördlingen, Schwäbisch Hall, Schwäbisch Gmünd, Memmingen, Kaufbeuren, Kempten, Lindau, and Ravensburg. The largest amongst them were Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Ulm, with Regensburg being the easternmost outpost and Strasbourg and Offenburg the ones furthest west. Which begs the question, why are they all concentrated in this comparatively small area? And that goes back again to the Hohenstaufen. Many of these places, like for instance Rothenburg ob der Tauber, Nürnberg, Dinkelsbühl, Schwäbisch Hall and Schwäbisch Gmünd, were founded by the early Hohenstaufen as a line of defense for their Duchy of Swabia against the House of Welf. If you want to catch up on that conflict, go back to episodes 45 following the reign of Conrad III. When the Welf lost their possessions in Swabia and Bavaria, the military significance of these places for the Imperial dynasty diminished. Still, these foundations enjoyed sponsorship by the Hohenstaufen, turning into the economic heartland of their territory. For instance, Schwäbisch Hall became one of the biggest financial contributors thanks to the salt brine that poured out of the local sources. These saline solutions had a concentration of 4 to 8%, making it the largest and most effective source of salt in the region. The city also specialized in minting the Heller, one of the smallest coins, worth half a pfennig. A German expression to say that someone had paid his dues in full is to say he'd paid it of Heller und Pfennig, all down to the very smallest fraction. Politically, these cities were tossed into an interesting situation when the Hohenstaufen fell between 1250 and 1268. They had been founded or controlled by the imperial family, either in their function as emperors or in their function as dukes of Swabia. With the Duchy of Swabia having disappeared, they had only one feudal overlord left, the emperor, which made them de facto free imperial cities, though the formal recognition happened sometimes between the reigns of Rudolf of Habsburg and Ludwig the Bavarian. Another inheritance from the Hohenstaufen period were the elites, the patricians. They were in the main descendants of the ministeriales, the serf knights that made up the garrisons of the castles. Their ranks were occasionally refreshed by new arrivals, either poor people climbing the ladder or by patricians from other cities moving across. The patricians socialized in their own drinking halls and religious confraternities. Membership in those often granted access to the city council and then facilitated shared commercial endeavors. Over time, many patricians abandoned mercantile activity and lived the life of minor nobility, including the castles, the jousting, and the ostentatious clothing. Below them ranked the artisans. They ranged from very wealthy specialized trades, which served high-class customers like gold and silversmiths, spice and wine merchants, sword makers, and miners at the top, and the weavers usually at the bottom. The more common crafts in the middle, like smiths, tanners, butchers, dyers, tailors, bakers, carpenters, cloth makers, retailers, and saddlers, they often formed guilds to promote their interests. In some places, the patricians prevented them from organizing themselves into guilds because the guilds tended to demand involvement in city politics, which often ended up in bloody conflicts. Being a free imperial city is nice, because it means you are effectively free to do whatever you want, without having to deal with a territorial prince. But it's also a dangerous position to be in because the institution that is supposed to protect you and that you pay some taxes to, the empire, is often unable to provide defense against rapacious neighboring dukes and bishops. I guess that many of you will at some point visit Rothenburg ob der Tauber, and if you have not put it on your list, you should. It is the mother of all cute half-timbered cities in Germany, its Plönlein house making twice daily appearances on social media, and its city wall still forming the outer perimeter of the place. But in the 14th and 15th century, Rothenburg was anything but cute. Nor were there elites or neighbors. The dominant figure in the city's history was Heinrich Toppler. If you drive towards Rothenburg just before the entrance to the town, you may see the Toppler-Schlösschen, arguably the very first summer house built by a commoner since the days of ancient Rome. Toppler had been mayor of Rothenburg between 1373 and 1407, though not continuously, since the constitution of the city limited terms to 1 year and prohibited contiguous terms. It is not quite clear how Toppler became immensely rich. He was born to a relatively new family. His grandfather had come into town from the countryside and had made some money trading in cattle and pigs, enough to buy a house in the best neighborhood. Heinrich's father was admitted to the city council, and Heinrich himself joined him there with his brother and his brother-in-law sometime in the 1370s. In 1380, he married Barbara Wernitzer, the sole child of the then richest man in town. And he clearly invested this money wisely. His fortune increased from 2,000 gulden in 1370 to 31,000 gulden in 1407. But what exactly he did is a bit unclear. The debt register of the city of Rothenburg mentions only small debts owed to him, and that suggests, for one, that he wasn't a banker, and secondly, that his mercantile activity too was limited. Otherwise, he would have owed or owned a lot more trading debt. He seemingly focused on real estate, of which he accumulated vast quantities, sometimes out of bankruptcies at very moderate prices. All these real estate deals took place during a time when the city of Rothenburg was expanding its territorial footprint dramatically. Not so much through military conquest, but usually by acquisition. Local nobles who had fallen on hard times sold lands and rights to the city to pay back loans or other debts. To what extent the astute patricians outsmarted the local nobles in their financial dealings in order to acquire their lands is up to speculation. Though one should point out that only one party to the transaction knew anything about maths. But what is not up to speculation is that by 1480 the city had built a 62-kilometer long border defense around their 350 square kilometer territory. This defense consisted of 3 walls and 2 ditches, the walls being constructed mainly of impenetrable hedges. There were 9 towers where travelers could enter the protected lands of Rothenburg after having paid their dues and had their wares inspected. Now, given that Toppler was mayor during the time and the engine behind the territorial expansion, it is not unfair to assume that he picked some of the juiciest pieces of land for himself. Though we would today regard such behavior as illegal, it was not part of the accusations leveled at him later in life, and they put all sorts of things to him. Toppler was not only the main administrator of Rothenburg in this period, he was also its main military commander and diplomat. And at this time, the 14th and 15th century was turbulent for most of these cities. The local princes were on the rise, trying to gobble up smaller cities like the Counts of Württemberg did, as we heard in last week's episode. At the same time, the nobles, the former vassals and ministeriales of the Hohenstaufen, were reeling from the after effects of the Black Death that had undermined their financial viability. Some turned to banditry, some became mercenaries, and others joined knightly associations. These associations, like St. Jürgenschild, became regional powers. So to deal with these threats, Toppler negotiated the participation of Rothenburg in the Schwäbische Städtebund, the League of Swabian Cities. City leagues had been explicitly prohibited by the Golden Bull, but nevertheless formed at regular intervals as cities pulled together to push back the princes and the knightly associations. Toppler established a particularly close relationship with King Wenceslas the Lazy, who he turned from a foe of the cities to its champion. Episodes 163 and 165. Thanks to Toppler's astute management of affairs, Rothenburg and the Swabian League itself managed to avoid severe repercussions following their defeat at the Battle of Döffingen in 1388, which Toppler had actually participated in. Shortly after King Wenceslas the Lazy was deposed in 1400, Toppler went into retirement. His relationship with the new king Ruprecht of the Palatinate was not what he had with Wenceslas. In that period, he began forming a broader network into the other cities in the area. After his wife had passed away, he had already married a lady from nearby Nördlingen in 1392, who was in turn related to several important patricians in Donauwörth, Augsburg and Munich. And in 1405 he married his son and his daughter into two of the major families of Nuremberg. During Toppler's absence from the levers of power, Rothenburg ran into politically hot water. By 1406 the Swabian League, the alliance for mutual support amongst the cities, had largely been dissolved. Rothenburg, as one of the northern cities, was most at risk from its two neighbours, the Hohenzollern Burggrafen of Nuremberg and the Prince-Bishops of Würzburg. Both these princes disliked the territorial expansion of Rothenburg and just generally would have liked, to gobble up the wealthy city. Rothenburg had so far managed to play these two adversaries out against each other, but that game came to a bitter end in 1406. The Burggraf provoked the city by citing it before his own imperial court in Nuremberg. Rothenburg rejected the authority of the court of the Burggraf and in turn cited the Burggraf in front of their own law courts. Result? Happy lawyers, anxious citizens. King Ruprecht of the Palatinate, who had formerly the final say in such a matter, sided with the Burggraf and threatened to put the city under the imperial ban. At which point the city council called Toppler back in the hope that he could resolve this difficult situation. Toppler did two things. One was that he prepared for the now likely military confrontation. He ordered provisions to be brought into town and reinforced the walls. Then he was looking for allies. Finding those amongst the various largely defunct city leagues proved difficult. So, in his despair, he sent his brother as a delegate to King Wenceslas, the deposed king, in the hope of getting some help from there. Wenceslas had been trying to get back onto his throne for a while, had found some supporters, but as we know from the previous season on the Reformation before the Reformation, his personal failings, aka the constant boozing, and his weak hold on Bohemia made all these ideas just pie in the sky. But pie in the sky was the only sustenance Toppler could muster. On July 17, 1407, the Burggraf, who had agreed some sort of profit-sharing with the Bishop of Würzburg, attacked Rothenburg. He broke through the outside fortifications that surrounded the territory and captured outlying castles. But when he got to the city itself, the inhabitants were forewarned. And as we mentioned several times before, capturing a city before firearms were invented worked either by surprise or required a long siege starving out the defenders. Thanks to Toppler's foresight, the city was ready for the onslaught and well provisioned. That quickly dawned on the Burggraf, and so he was willing to negotiate. 6 weeks after his invasion had begun, the two sides signed a ceasefire. That ceasefire left Rothenburg with a number of onerous obligations. However, the peace agreement that was signed 4 months later, after mitigation by King Ruprecht, was a lot more favorable to the city. The Burggraf was not given any money to cover the cost of his army, which left him in financial difficulty. The city was released from the imperial ban, but had to bear the destruction of its castles, lands and crops. So, in the end, just a big waste of money with a side dish of famine. Why such lenient terms? Well, there seems to have been some side arrangement, because 7 weeks after the peace treaty, Heinrich Toppler was thrown in jail. There was a trial, though we have no documentation of what he was explicitly accused of. His enemies had captured 3 letters that proved that he had negotiated with King Wenceslas, which could be seen as high treason against King Ruprecht of the Palatinate. There may have been other accusations, such as that he was trying to make himself a dominus, a dictator of the city. There's a legend that he gambled with the Burggraf over the ownership of the city, an idea that came from his coat of arms that showed 2 dice, but carried no dice. And in an obviously totally uncorrelated sequence of events, the city received an imperial court order that Toppler's massive fortune was to be handed over to the king, a king they called Ruprecht of the empty pocket behind his back. On an unknown day later, Heinrich Toppler died in prison, either decapitated or simply left to die of thirst. His body was brought to the Church of St. Jacob, where he was buried in the chapel he had built for his family. Having had premonitions that things may go badly, he had sent most of his movable fortune to his children in Nuremberg. There, his descendants survived the purge and established families that thrived well into the 17th century. Not in Rothenburg, though, but in Nuremberg. His summer house, the Toppler-Schlösschen, passed to several patrician families in Rothenburg and is still in private ownership, but it can be visited. What we can take from this story are several things. One, that these patrician elites across these free imperial cities were often connected through links of marriage, and that families occasionally moved from one place to another, acquiring citizenship and standing there fairly quickly. That not all patricians were merchants. In fact, many lived lives as warriors and diplomats rather than as traders. And finally, that politics were cutthroat, leaving even the most competent of mayors dead in a cell when political exigencies required it. Which now gets us to the main topic of today's episode, the Grosse Ravensburger Handelsgesellschaft. Ravensburg, as mentioned earlier, lay at the southernmost end of this corridor of free imperial cities established by the Hohenstaufen. And it wasn't even a Hohenstaufen foundation. Ravensburg had been established by the Hohenstaufen's enemies, the House of Welf. But when Welf VI made Barbarossa his heir, Ravensburg, like all his Swabian possessions, passed to the imperial family, and when they fell, Ravensburg became a free imperial city. But then, as now, Ravensburg was a much smaller place than Konstanz or Ulm, and a less advantageously located one to boot. Konstanz laid the connection between the upper and the lower lake, where a bridge crossed over into Switzerland, the only bridge for a long way in either direction, making it the perfect connection point on a north-south route. Ulm, on the other hand, was the last navigable point on the Danube, making the ideal stopping-off point for an east-west trade all the way down to Hungary. Ravensburg, on the other hand, lay inland on one of the many trade routes in the region, not exactly the obvious choice for the by far largest trading firm in the whole of the German lands. The year of foundation for the company is usually given as the year 1380. However, the reality is more likely a gradual transition rather than a one-time starting point. At the heart of the early phase were three individuals: Hengi Humpis, who was from Ravensburg originally, Rudolf Mötteli from Buchhorn, which is modern-day Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance, and Ludfried Mundbrat from Constance. The Mötteli family acquired Ravensburg citizenship in 1375, whilst the Mundbrats came in no earlier than 1411. All three families had been trading for a long time before they joined forces. They benefited from the main trading routes of the region, of which there were basically four major ones. The first was the Transalpine route across the Gotthard, Simplon and Splügen passes to Milan, and from there to the main Mediterranean ports of Genoa and Venice. Then there was the land route west via Constance, Zurich, Bern, Geneva, Lyon, and from there into southern France or Spain. An eastern route followed the Danube from Ulm all the way to Vienna and Hungary. And finally, there was the northern route to Frankfurt, Cologne, Antwerp and Bruges. The challenge for these trading houses was the same we encountered in our discussion about the Hanseatic League. Merchants who wanted to scale up could no longer travel with their merchandise, as had been the case in the early Middle Ages. They stayed at home in their counting houses and kept an eye of the wares that flowed back and forth across their network of correspondents and clients. And once that is the business model, two things matter more than anything else: trust and information. Merchants needed to know what goods were in demand at the destination and what prices were at the point where they wanted to procure them. And they needed to trust the people who acted on their behalf, the apprentices or shippers who travelled with the goods, and the agents who bought or sold the goods. In the Hanse system, this problem was solved through an elaborate surveillance operation. Each merchant would have several correspondent agents in each city that he or she would trade with. These correspondent agents would not only keep an eye on the market, but also on the behavior of the other correspondents. That way a merchant would know fairly quickly if, say, the creditworthiness or honesty of one of his agents were placed in doubt. and the higher a merchant rose within their city, the more access he or she would gain to information. As a member of the city council, he would hear about the state of negotiations with kings and princes. He would hear where pirate activity was most intense and what would be done about it, etc., etc. And finally, long-standing relationships, intermarriage, and the fact that Hanse traders all spoke Low German created trust between the participants in that network. The downside of that model was that it kept the average size of the firms comparatively small. If every merchant had to split their orders amongst several agents to maintain that surveillance system, well, neither of these agents could become dominant, and vice versa. If you want to dig into the system and its underpinnings, check out the season on the Hanseatic League, specifically the episodes 119 and 120. The southern German trading system was built on a very different model, a model developed earlier in Italy. The great Italian firms relied heavily on networks of agents employed directly by the firm, and most often members of the family. These agents held a stake in the firm and were hence incentivized to procure accurate information and try to achieve the best possible prices. The main constraints in this model were the number of family members and trustworthy business partners one could recruit. And that is likely one of the reasons the three firms of Humpis, Mötteli and Mundprat joined forces in Ravensburg in the early 15th century. They all had been extremely successful merchants, but growth must have hit a wall as they had run out of individuals they could send out as their representatives. By pooling their resources, they could establish a much larger network of agents than they could set up individually. Another key benefit was that the combination reduced competition, increased pricing power with suppliers and customers, and reduced risk. And this was a real company, meaning the partners would put in capital in the form of cash or wares and would in return receive dividends proportionally to their share of the capital. Membership quickly expanded beyond the three families, bringing in roughly 40 to 90 further, usually smaller partners. They came from all over the place, from Wangen, Isny, Landau, Memmingen, Konstanz, Biberach, Ulm, Nördlingen, Freiburg and Fribourg, as well as Lucerne. Most partners were active in the company, often as agents abroad. They would get their expenses covered and received an additional bonus based on their trading performance. The company would do a full account of the books every 3 years to determine the dividend payments and bonuses. This happened under the supervision of the three regents, effectively the management board. This, again, a difference with the Hanse, when the accounts were only done once, upon the death or the bankruptcy of the merchant. One of the regents tended to reside in Ravensburg, at the headquarters on Marktstraße 59, where the books were kept, whilst the other two were travelling, inspecting the counting houses or accompanying particularly valuable shipments. Which gets to the question, why did they choose Ravensburg instead of the much larger and much better positioned Konstanz, where the Mundprat family had come from? The answer lies most likely in the more stable political situation. Following the Great Church Council that had lasted 4 years from 1414 to 1418, Konstanz experienced a prolonged period of internal conflict between patricians and artisans and between the major families. Ravensburg seems to have found a more stable balance between patricians and artisan interests that kept disruptions to a minimum. In terms of traded goods, one of the key products were textiles, namely linen and what is called barchent or fustian. Linen is made from flax, which grew all over the area north of Lake Constance. Barchent, as it's called in German, or fustian as it is known in England, was a heavy, hard-wearing cloth made with a cotton weft and a linen warp, meaning that on a loom the vertical yarn is made from linen and the horizontal yarn, that's the one that travels back and forth, is made from cotton. The advantage of that technique is that fustian is hard-wearing and at the same time more flexible than pure linen. And we still wear a type of fustian which we call denim. In other words, This was not a top-end luxury product, but a very useful one, specifically for the working classes from Flanders to Saragossa. Another advantage was that it could be produced on small looms by peasants during the winter months, providing them with an extra income. I have not found a specific analysis on how well this was working out for the peasants making the fustian or linen. But historically, this kind of piecework was a form of pretty merciless exploitation. Given that in case of the fustian, the buyers were also delivering the cotton, the laborers were almost completely dependent on these merchants. So, margins in this business must have been pretty good. What further helped margins was that in some markets, like for example Barcelona and Saragossa, the Ravensburgers gained a de facto monopoly on these kinds of textiles. And even shipping it all the way to Flanders and Hungary, where they had competition, seemed to have worked out as well. The Handelsgesellschaft established strict quality controls for their textiles that ranked the products into 3 levels that were marked with 1, 2 or 3 crowns. Another export from Ravensburg was paper. One of Germany's earliest paper mills opened in 1407 and was again held to high quality standards, making it popular and competitive with the Italian luxury paper Gutenberg had insisted upon. The return shipments concentrated more on luxury items. For example, from Spain they imported silk, rabbit furs, wool, pearls, coral, olive oil, almonds, dates, figs, raisins, cumin, wine, indigo, and very importantly, sugar and saffron. Sugar, usually acquired in Spain, and saffron from Spain and Aquileia, became one of the hallmarks of the Ravensburger Gesellschaft. Again, their seal of quality was widely recognized and commanded a significant premium. At some point, they even opened a sugar factory near Valencia. In Italy, they again bought spices and fruits, but also weapons, nails, and other metalwork, which Milan was particularly famous for. On their returns from Flanders, they brought the fine woolen cloth that was in demand all across Europe. And they participated in the great local trades, the copper, tin, pots and pans from Nuremberg and Bohemia, and they went to the fairs in Nördlingen and Frankfurt. Their trade was not just operating on a hub-and-spoke basis. They would ship Spanish products directly to Cologne or to Antwerp, and they would buy textiles in Bourg-en-Bresse for sale in Spain. It was a truly pan-European operation on a scale few northern trading houses could compete with. There's again a map of their trading network on this episode's webpage, the link to which you can find in the show notes. It made its partners, in particular the 3 founding families, immensely rich. To put that into context, Heinrich Toppler at his peak was worth about 31,000 gulden. The Mötterlins' capital in the society was 150,000 gulden. The Humpis brought in 131,000 gulden, and the next one down had 100,000. So the company as a whole accounted for many multiples of what the so-called King of Rothenburg ever possessed. Which gets us to the question, why the company that was so successful ultimately dissolved in 1530. And as always, there are many reasons. One was that after the death of one of the founders, Hengi Humpis, several members fought over the post of regent, the board members. And this was not a polite fight with occasional harsh words. This could get physical, with attempted kidnappings and incarceration of clients. But by that time, several original members, including the extremely wealthy Mötterli family, had already left the company. They had disagreed on strategy in Spain, and so they went to St. Gall, where they founded a new organization. Meanwhile, competitors like the Diesbach-Watt families and later the Wöhlin-Welser from Memmingen competed aggressively. In 1477, another group of partners left to set up their own shop that became known as La Chica, the Little Ravensburger Company. Another fatal blow came with a shift in trading patterns during the Age of Exploration. Vasco da Gama found a way to India, disturbing the route spices moved, and after Columbus, sugar production moved to the Caribbean. But the true weakness was the inherent conservatism. the great Ravensburg trading company was very much still a medieval institution, not an early modern one. When one of their associates opened a printing press in Saragossa, the first in Spain, some of the partners objected to the point that they left. And the company observed the strict ban on usury the church still insisted upon. That barred them from any outright banking activities except for money transfer and letters of credit. When the Fugger and the Welser and their willingness to fund the great princes and emperors and their expansion into the New World came onto the scene, the Ravensburgers no longer stood a chance. In around 1530, the great Ravensburg trading company appears to have ceased to operate. Some of the founding families kept staying and trading, but mostly they turned into landed gentry, having converted their mercantile wealth into castles and manor houses. Which begs the question, how come the company accounts were found covered in bird droppings in the home of Prince Max von Baden in 1911? As it happened, the last accountant of the company did take all the old account books with him when he shut up shop on Marktstrasse 59 in Ravensburg. He kept them at home, probably out of sentimentality, something his son and grandson shared. At least to the point that when said grandson joined the Cistercians at the great monastery of Salem, he took the papers along and deposited them in the monastery archives. There they were registered as useless old trading documents and put into a drawer in a dark corner. And when that drawer was opened by accident or on purpose, the swallows moved in. And thanks to their care, we now have this extraordinarily detailed account of a late medieval trading operation, a truly unique document. In the faint hope that this podcast will not end up in a dusty corner of the internet covered in AI bird droppings, I would appreciate any help you can give the show. That does not necessarily mean financial by going to historyofthegermans.com/support, but it could also be leaving a review, a comment on social media or Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you can think of that could bring in new listeners. I'll see you again next week when we may or may not talk about the richest or maybe not the richest person that ever lived.